Welcome everyone to the second Careers for the Planet. My name is Magda, and I'm a comms and events director for the Earthrise. And it's my pleasure to step in for Susie, who's on a leave. She's fine, but hello, Susie, if you're watching this. Um, and yeah, I have a pleasure to introduce you to our today's guest. We have a pleasure of hosting Philippe Birker from Climate Farmers, and he's going to tell us all about different pathways that he has taken within his career and how that led him to a small village in Portugal. And at the end, like I mentioned, there will be some time for Q&A, so you can either write your questions in the chat or you can just wait till the end and then we'll address them when the time comes. And yeah, Philippe, I'll hand the floor over to you whenever you're ready.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. It's my first time presenting to a younger audience. My venture, Climate Farmers, which is basically what I dedicated the last 6 years of my life to. And the interesting thing is that what got me to kick off that venture was actually the reality of climate change really kicking in. So the journey that I'm currently on was really started in the middle of nowhere in the Portuguese mountains in 2017. So now about 9 years ago. At that point, I was living in Amsterdam, and I was working for another social business called Fairphone, which some of you maybe may know, which is basically making more sustainable and modular smartphones. I was also I just closed down a nightclub that I was running in Amsterdam after 3 years, and I had spent the entirety of my twenties in Amsterdam and Berlin. Really enjoyed city life, let's say, after growing up on the countryside in Germany in my youth. And what I was really missing was to have more nature in my life and to have a bit more of a rural environment again. But I wanted to take the people from the city with me. And in Portugal, there's a very interesting situation, which is that most of the people are living at the coast, and in the center of the country, it's very empty. And I think in many areas of the world, we have this rural desertification. And in Portugal, what they did to combat this is they made a law that you can rebuild broken down houses and you don't need any planning permissions or any licenses or anything. You can just do what you want. And because in my 20s, I was really into electronic music, I had a lot of friends that were building up stages and so on at festivals. So I had quite some handymans in my personal network. And we ended up buying an abandoned village, essentially, which is what you're looking at right now. It's in the Serra da Lusa mountain range in the center of the country. And there was about 60 people living there until the late 1960s. And then it stood empty. Um, and with that land, we initially bought it with 9 people. We also had access to 7.5 hectares. And that was kind of what started me looking more into agriculture and initially into permaculture, which you maybe know as well. And around that, I also started looking deeper into what's happening in our agri-food system. And what I realized there is I can specifically speak for the European context, but I would be surprised if it's very different in other parts of the world. Because in Europe, our agricultural system is massively failing our farmers. So farmers are protesting on the streets. Young people don't want to go into farming anymore. We all need farmers every day, several times to provide food for us, but it's not something that anyone is really striving for. And the average age of farmers in the European Union is 57 years old, which is a massive problem. At the same time, it's also failing our planet, seeing where we are at in this call with the Earth Prize and what you are doing. I'm sure you know the planetary boundaries from Johan Rockström. And you maybe know as well that agriculture is currently the largest driver for the crossing of these planetary boundaries. It's responsible for 24% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, and it's the largest driver of biodiversity loss. And you might say, at least we're making money. Well, unfortunately, if we're counting in the costs of our current agri-food system, specifically to human and planetary health, then we are losing 15 trillion US dollars a year. So the only one that's really making money is very few, very large agrochemical companies, such as Bayer, for example. And then back then in 2017, 2018, it wasn't such a thing yet, such a topic yet. But I did found some papers from Wageningen University, which is an agricultural university in the Netherlands from the 80s and 90s, already talking about the fact that if we are farming more in line with nature and by mimicking nature, then we can essentially reverse the negative effects of our current agricultural system. And this way of farming is called regenerative agriculture. It is by now a bit more known. There's an amazing documentary out on Netflix called Kiss the Ground, which got some, which essentially inspired, I think, a lot of people to start looking into this. And what regenerative agriculture does is it uses the potential of plants through photosynthesis to take carbon out of the atmosphere and to store it in the plants, such as trees, for example. But any plant that you see in your environment, I hope that you're seeing at least one plant from wherever you are in the world right now. Any plant that you're looking at is taking carbon out of the atmosphere, storing it in the plant, and through the roots, if it's in the live soil, it's bringing it into the soil. And at the same time, if you focus on healthy soils, as you do in Region Ag, you also increase water storage capacity. So you increase the capacity of soil to soak up water when it rains, which helps with drought and flooding preventions. And you also increase biodiversity. So for me, it was clear that this is a very impactful thing to work on because it's one of the only areas where we can turn a problem into the solution. So we can not only mitigate climate change, but we could actually potentially reverse it. And that's why we founded Climate Farmers with the vision to live in a world where humans have found their place in the larger ecosystem again, with which we mean that we believe humans are a keystone species, which means we have a larger than average impact on our environment. It's an honorable title we share among others with beavers. But while beavers have a very largely positive effect, we currently have a very negative effect, very much due to the way how we're farming, for example. And we believe if we would be all doing regenerative farming, that effect could be a positive one again. Now, I'm German, and Germans are very structured, and we love infrastructure. So that's why we said, as a German company, our mission is to build the infrastructure for scaling regenerative agriculture. And what we mean with that is that we really want to make sure that the way how the movement is growing, and that movement was just starting back then, is really in deep roots, and that there's a community around it, that there's frameworks, that there's policies around it, and that we really make sure that it is growing stable and that it's not just a hype and a bust, such as so many other promising movements that have happened in the past. And I went to business school. I studied business. And if you do that, one of those things that they will always tell you is to be laser focused and to get one thing right, to just focus on that one thing, especially if you study entrepreneurship, such as me. And so initially, the idea of climate farmers was to generate carbon credits, so to basically pay farmers for the carbon that they're sequestering in the soil. But back then, I went on a 1 year pilgrimage and I visited farmers around Western Europe that were doing regenerative agriculture, all of the farmers that I could find, which wasn't many, but it was 60 farmers in total. And I basically went from farm to farm. And one thing that became very clear back then was it's not so simple. Farmers are embedded into a wider system. There's a lot of complexities at play in the decisions that they're taking, in the way how they're farming. And so with climate farmers, we also realized that just doing carbon credits is not going to be enough. So what we did is we did something that's called a systems map. So we interviewed different actors from across the agri-food system, and we tried to understand what are the current drivers of the food system that we all are essentially, to some extent, a part of. And one thing that was very clear in there is that there's very strong what we call feedback loops. And one of those feedback loops is, for example, the before mentioned influence of the agrochemical corporations, which make a lot of money, with which they hire a lot of lobbyists, which then influence the policy in the European context in Brussels, which then leads to more subsidies for production maximization, which means that farmers only get subsidies and only get paid for the amount of yield that they're having, which then leads again to them buying more agrochemical products, which then leads again to them having more influence. So this is one of those feedback loops which we're currently experiencing in Europe specifically. In order to counter that, we basically built a bottom-up movement. So these farmers that I visited, they all loved what they were doing, but they all felt very lonely. They all were considered crazy by the other farmers in the area. And so the very first thing that we did is we connected all of them in a WhatsApp group. And there was very beautiful exchanges between the farmers, supporting each other, and sometimes talking just about family trouble or the children wanting or not wanting to take over their farms. Of course, the weather, very important topic for any farmer. And one of the first things we did then was we brought all of these farmers together in the world's only farmers' castle in southern Germany. Um, we started organizing events on farms, online and offline, where farmers could learn from each other how they're doing regenerative agriculture. This escalated, and we organized several thousand events by now all over Europe, reaching as far as Azerbaijan, where we were at COP 2 years ago as well. And then we started looking into more into systems transformation. So how do you transform a system? And the book that I can highly recommend there is from Donella Meadows, which is kind of the queen of systems thinking. Um, and she established the leverage points for systems transformation, where she says you have the cultural aspect, which is kind of like the really goals, beliefs, and values that a society is holding. Then you have the structural aspect and then the practical one. So the cultural one was really the part that we were doing with events, was bringing the people together in person, was connecting them with each other. The structural one is for us around changing the rules and especially the legislation. If you're in Europe, maybe you heard about the nature restoration law and maybe you know the Club of Rome, which is a think tank on climate change, and we collaborated with them to push this nature restoration law through, which is now the legal basis for farmers to get paid for biodiversity increase on their farm.
Biodiversity increase.
And then we also were involved with the funding of another organization called Yara, which is essentially a lobby organization for regenerative farmers by farmers in Brussels. And then lastly, we have the practical aspect, which is usually always the one which is easiest to get funding for because people love data normally, where we basically developed a measurement tool for regenerative agriculture in order to prevent the term from being greenwashed. So we sat together with our farmer community and we developed indicators for ecological, economic, and social regeneration, where we basically look at, for example, an impact area such as soil health, then the different categories among it, such as soil function, an indicator for that, and then a metric for it. And through that, we're basically scoring farms as regenerative, verifying for that, and enabling them to get paid for what we call ecosystem services. Now, you might be interested, how did you fund all of this? So initially, at least in the European context, if you have any kind of business idea, it's very recommendable to kind of shop around a bit and see where you register because for cities, it's startups are sexy. I think that's the best thing to say it, and especially social startups and climate startups are something that cities like to have around. So most major, I think all European major cities such as Amsterdam, Vienna, Berlin, Lisbon, they all have startup funding programs. So what we did is before we registered our company, we applied to a variety of these and we registered where we got the best offer, which in our case was a high-tech seed debt, which is a funding from the Berlin Senate, which basically gave us 120,000 euros and a free office in order to register our company there and get started there. And then we participated in the Google Impact Challenge, which is a very interesting program where Google basically puts every year 10 million euros into a pot. And then any kind of organization can apply. We were just two people at that point, so very small. We were just funded, but we had a very big vision of building this regenerative agri-food system. And amazingly, Google selected us and they gave us a 650,000 euro grant, which was very nice because Google also, they don't always have the best image, but I have to say they're very arrogant in a very nice way because a lot of times with funding applications, you have to do a lot of reporting, which you can imagine is not fun for anyone. Google doesn't do that. So we literally didn't, they never asked any questions after they transferred us the money. And the original email just to have from them is like, you don't have to do any reporting because if we would ask you to do reporting, it would mean we did a bad job screening and we don't do a bad job screening. I was like, fair enough. Like, there's a logic I can get behind. So that was really nice. That was the point where we started hiring a team, where I hired my first 10 employees. Also, 650,000 euros sounds like a lot of money. It's not that much. We blew it basically in 1.5 years on salaries. which means you need more money afterwards because salaries are expensive and you have to always pay usually double of what the person gets in the end. It's what the company has to pay. And then we go on a research grant together with some universities. We got an institutional investor on board, specifically an agri-food systems investor called Rockstart. Then we found another very nice person, a so-called high net worth individual, which gave us 2.5 million euros in order to really scale our operations. And then we won another EU grant in 2024. And that's essentially the funding that we have collected so now until now. And then we also have a very interesting organizational structure, which is specifically something that exists in the German context, which is a social business company. So it's called a GmbH, which means we can have business revenue, but we can also accept donations, which is very nice. So companies and foundations that give us money can get tax exemptions for that. The only downside is I can never sell shares of my company. So I will never cash out and make a few millions like you see in the startup movies, etc. But the nice thing is we have a lot of different possibilities of being able to make business revenue, which is one third of our revenue, get donations as well, and then also have these research grants. And that's why we decided to go for that organizational structure. And I think I will leave it at that and happy to answer any questions that you might have.